So where we left off is we had two models already created. They were associated with each other. We had our house model, where a house just had a name and a certain number of points. A student model exists where the student has a name and the student also has a reference to a house, which ends up being a house ID foreign key. And then we had created a houses controller, which had two actions in it. One action to retrieve all the houses and an associated view to display them. And then one action to retrieve a house by ID, an associated view to retrieve it. And we had some routes that would lead to those actions. So we had the root route going to the houses index. We had /houses/ a ID placeholder going to the show, and that's how this ID is present in the show so that we can look up a house by ID. And so we're going to continue by creating a new controller, which will be very similar in style to the houses one. Again, it's using only 2 of the 7 possible RESTful routes. It's using the index and the show, and it's going to do almost the same thing. And the idea with Rails is that you can get pretty far with your controllers just cherry picking which of the 7 RESTful routes you want to include, and then you can build like a CRUD app based off of that, right? Because if you have the full 7 routes, you will have one that is for showing all of the collection, one that is showing one of the collection, one for creating, actually a pair of routes for creating, a pair of routes for updating, and then one for deleting. So those are all your different CRUD actions. So we're going to add the students controller. It's also going to add 2 new routes to our system. So the collection route for the index is going to be at /students. For showing an individual student, that's going to be at /student/ID. There will be one view associated with each of those actions, and we will proceed from there. So that's where we'll begin. I have 3 different terminals running, one running my server, one running the Rails console, and one where I can just type in commands. And it's at this one where I can type in commands where I'm going to begin by creating the new controller. So I'll say Rails G for generate, what I want to generate, which is the controller. The name of this controller is the students controller. Again, conventions here just dictate that we typically map controllers to models, and then the controllers are the pluralized versions of the model names. So it's the students controller that maps to the student model. And then I know up front that I need 2 actions, so I can ask for them, index and show. And if you ever typo anything in this sort of command and get to a point where like you misspelled index, you misspelled show, or you misspelled the controller, and after it runs, you could run a Rails D controller name, and it just removes all of the files and folders and everything that it created associated with what you asked for, and then you could run the generator again. So I'll run the generator like this: Rails G controller, students with 2 different actions. And that creates for me a few things. I can go into my source control and I can say added a students controller. Your source control is maybe not going to work. I'm not too sure. You've cloned a repository that you don't have ownership over. So you may be able to do adds and commits, but you definitely won't be able to push those back up to my repository because you won't have write access to the repo up on GitHub. So I'm going to open up what was generated there. In the app controllers folder, I have my students controller. Going to double click on that. In the app views folder, there is now a students subfolder, and I can open up both of the views inside of there. I'll probably need access to the layout, so I'll go in the layouts folder and open up the application.html.erb that's inside of there. And in the config folder, I want access to the routing. So there's the routes.rb that is in there. The generator put 2 routes into my system. I don't want those generated routes. I'm going to create my own. So I will delete both of those. So based on this planning document, I now already have my students controller, and when we look into it, we'll see that there is a index and a show action. They're empty right now. And I know the plan for my routes is that a get request to /students and a get request to /students/ID will themselves route to those 2 actions. I have to create those routes now, and I could create them manually or using the resources command. Manually, it would look something like a get request to students would go to the students controller's index action. So it's always like the HTTP verb, the path, and then where it's going. And I could even associate like a route name with that, an as command. But I don't want to do that when Rails will generate those for me. So you just know that you can always generate routes manually, especially if you want to sort of step outside of the 7 provided RESTful routes. You can create them on your own, any route you want, by verb, by path, and where you want to point it to. But because we're staying within conventions, I can just go to the resources command and say, I'm working with the students controller, so make me some resource-based routes for the students controller. And again, like the house controller, I only want access to the index and the show. And when I save this, Rubocop will rewrite that to something that looks like this, a %I, which is just a shortcut for an array full of symbols. So here I'm sort of explicitly making an array of symbols. It'll just be shortened down to this when I hit save. And so that in comments here will give me something that looks like this, a get/students that's going to go to the students controller's index, and a get request to /students/some ID, which is going to go to the students controller's show. Like that. So I'll hit save. Rubocop will write that for me. The index and the show already have some HTML in them, just some placeholder HTML. There's going to be an H1 inside of both of them that will specify which controller and action is sort of being accessed. And if I look at my controller itself, the index and the show are empty right now, but I can at least test my routes out. So if I go to /students, I should see the index view, this one right here. And if I go to /students/any number, I should see the show. So if I go over to my browser and I go to /students, there's what I was expecting. If I go to /students/any numeric ID, regardless if it exists in my database or not, because we're not doing any database access at this point, it'll tell me that it's properly gone to the show view. So that just at least gives me the confidence that my routes are set up correctly. And then note that that HTML is being brought to us inside of a much larger full HTML page by way of the application layout. So this message up at the top here and this link to home, that's coming from the layout. So if we look in the application layout, we can see inside of there's that H1, there's the link to home, there's the footer, and the individual views are being injected into the layout where it says yield. And so now I can go and actually implement these 2 actions here. I like to put just in a comment above them the actual sort of HTTP requests that will trigger those actions. It's not a requirement. I just like to document them in this way. So I'd say here, this is a GET request to /students. And this is going to be triggered by a GET request to /students/some ID. And just like we did with the houses controller, here I can load up all students. I make it an instance variable with the @ sign in front of it, and that way it is available automatically to my views. And that's just a quirk of how Rails operates. It takes the private instance variables and makes them accessible inside of the views. And so I can go to the student model and say like all, or if I wanted to, like, for example, order all of the students by name, I could say like, give me all the students ordered by name. And then I could go over to the associated view, because unless we circumvent the default action by, say, doing something like a redirect, what's going to happen is that at the end of running this index action, it's automatically going to try to load up the associated view. So auto magically loads the associated view, which in this case is in the app views students folder, and it's got the same name as the action. So the action is index, the view is index, and then all of our views are .html, .erb. And then this @students variable will be accessible within there. So I can go into that view. I can delete what's in there right now. I'll add an H2 and I'll say all students. I can put in a little if statement to say, like, if the students collection is empty, do one thing, otherwise do something else. So if it's empty, we could just say there are no students in the school. So just like a helpful little message, here we're going to make an unordered list of students by using a loop. So if we didn't have this little message in there, all that would happen is like an empty UL would end up inside of our document, and that wouldn't be overly helpful for anyone visiting the page. And so inside of there, I can go to my students collection and loop over each student like that. And in this case, I'm just going to drop down an LI for each one of them, where I echo out the student.name property of each student object in my student collection. And most Rails views look like this, sort of some mixture of decision statements and looping statements. You really don't want any computation to be happening inside of the views. You definitely don't want to be ever directly accessing the model from within the view. It's the controller. So if you have like extra logic around processing the request, the controller should be handling that. If you have special extra logic around the sort of the domain knowledge of the system, that needs to go into your appropriate models. And the controller ends up being like the traffic cop that sits in between the views and the models. You never want to directly access the models within the view, because that would be overly coupling the view and the models together. So if I go to this running version of the site and I just go to /students, that should trigger this controller action. It should load up all my students and it should display them down below. Did I not save it? I've noticed a few times what has happened with my application, and I don't know if it'll happen for yours in the same way, but it's the Rails server incorrectly sometimes caches things. And so I think I'm going to have to, for mine, Control C on the server, start it back up and see if that flushes the cache. Yeah, that's frustrating. That should never happen in development mode. Rails is not actually supposed to be aggressively caching anything, and nor is the browser. You're supposed to, anytime you make a change to a view, that should be immediately reflected in your development server. However, if you're ever in a position where you know you've made a change to your view and you're just not seeing that change happen when you reload the browser, that is the sign that the server has glitched a little bit, and you have to go to your server, Control C it to stop it, and then restart it. Yeah. Yes. So the controller looks like this. It's the only one we're working with right now. We're assigning the return value of all the students ordered by name to an @students variable, which we then use inside of our view. And I can now go to my Git and I can say implemented the student index action and view. And if I wanted to test my logic out, the logic that had to do with like whether there were students present or not, I could go to my console, my Rails console, and I could just delete all the students. I would also have to delete the associated houses because there's a foreign key reference there. So I could go to house.destroy all. You don't necessarily have to do this. I'm going to repopulate my database immediately afterwards. But house.destroy all would destroy all the houses. You don't like that? Foreign constraint file. Oh, that. Do I have to delete the students first? I don't think so. How many houses do I have? Why don't you like that? Oh, it is the other order. Student.destroy all. Yeah. So I've now deleted all the students just so that I could test that little path. And again, anytime I put something like that in my code, if I was developing this not in front of the classroom, I'd be doing so in like a test-driven way, and so I'd have a test that would test that logic out for me. But because I'm not doing this in a test-driven way, I want to assure myself that the decision that I put into my code actually works as expected, right? I don't want to be surprised, 2 days down the road or 20 days down the road that some part of my application doesn't work as I intended. So if I put an if statement into my code where there's 2 possible paths, I want to check out those possible paths or have a test that vets those 2 possible paths to note that they're actually properly working. And so now I'll go back to my command line and just run my Rails DB seed again to get that data back in place. Make sure that runs properly. And there you go. And the reason why it wasn't letting me destroy my houses is that each student has a foreign key to the house, and so there would be a bunch of orphan students if I tried to delete the houses first. And now we can do a similar path, but for the show. So we have a get request to /student/some ID. That ID is going to end up in the params hash at position ID. And so if we had called it something else, it would be at a different placeholder inside of the params hash. The params hash is where our parameters end up. And so inside of here, I can create a student variable because it's just a single student that I'm loading up. And I can go and I can find that student using the ID that is coming to me from the URL. And just like above here, the associated view is automatically going to be loaded up. And so that is going to do this. And that view will have access to this @student object, which is going to be an object of type capital S student. And so now it'll be up for me to go into the associated view and display that data. So right here I can make like an H2. I can echo out the student name. And then I might say something like, this student belongs to house. And then I could go to the student's house. So I could say student dot house dot name, period. And I would just go quickly over to the browser, and I'm going to check that if I need to know a particular primary key of a student. And so from my console, I will just say what the last student is. That will let me know that I have a student with a primary key of 124 in it. And so I should be able to go to /students/124 to see this particular student right here. And so I should see Garrick as the student. And if I want to know this student's house name, it's Hufflepuff. So in my data, again, I want to validate that the code is working as I expect it to. And so I'm expecting when I ask for student 124 that I see Garrick Ollivander, and I see that Garrick is part of House Hufflepuff. So if I go over here, I put in 124, and I see that my expectations are correct. It's done what I wanted to. So I like to see like programming and debugging sort of like the scientific method, right? You're making little hypotheses about how you think your code works, and then you're testing to see if that hypothesis is correct. And if it isn't, you're fixing your code because there's a bug in it. And yours might not be 124, right? You may not have run your seed script the same number of times as me, so you might have to go and find a different ID. And so that's good. This is showing me all of my students. It would be nice if I could link to those students. It would be nice if I could link to those students here as well, right? So we have a page for each one of those students. Let's link to them. And we could do that in two places. So the two places where the students are being shown is at /students here and on the individual house page. So that's the house show page. So I'll open up that house show page as well. So that's in my app views houses folder. And it would also be handy for me to be able to navigate, maybe by way of this little menu up at the top here, to that /students page. I don't want to have the user type in /students up here to get to that page. They should be able to navigate by way of a link. So we can do that. I want to see the routes that exist in my system, and the easiest way to do that is just to put in a non-existent route. That brings up, at least in development mode, this routing error, which then shows the routes that exist. And it also shows the route helpers that exist. So I can see if I want to get a link to the student's index action, which is this one here, I can use the student's path helper. So I will go to my layout file that I opened earlier, and up here in the header I will just add in like a pipe character, and then I will make another link to. I will say link to, and the link text is students, and the helper I said was the student's path helper. And in this case, the student's path helper doesn't need any extra information to know how to forge that link, because the link itself is just /students. It doesn't have, for example, an ID placeholder in it. So the student's path has all the information it needs to generate the correct link. And so we use link2 to generate that ahref for us. And so if I go back to my browser and I go back to, say, the home page, there are now 2 links up there, one to home and one to students, that I can navigate back and forth between. And then, as I said, it would be nice to be able to have these be links to the individual student pages. For that, the routing system needs a little bit more information. So if I go into the app students here, the app, it'll be the index that I want. The app views students index. I want to make this a link to each student's page. If I go over here and again bring up that routing error, we'll see that each student's page, the student show action, which is that individual member page for the student, includes an ID. And the helper name is student path, singular. I can't simply do this though. I cannot just do, well, I want to link to where the link text is the student name and the helper is student path, because that doesn't give student path enough information to make the link, because the student path includes a placeholder, right? It needs to know which student I'm linking to by ID. And so if I try to do this, I'm going to get an error. So if I go back to my students page, we can see that error, which it says no route matches action show student missing required keys ID. So it gives you a pretty direct idea as to what's wrong here. You've tried to forge a link using the routing system, but you were missing some required information. You're missing an ID. So all we need to do is pass to the student path an object that has the ID that we need, which is the individual student object that we're working with right now. So I can just say student like that. I go back over here and I reload this page. Lo and behold, I've got all these links. If I click on one of them, I get to that student's page, and it properly puts their ID into the URL for me by passing the student into the student path. The nice thing about Rails is when you really work with its conventions and you don't stray outside of those, then you can even do things in sort of a simpler way. And it's so common to have this pattern where you have an object of a particular type and then you have a path with the same name as the type. So you can actually just get away with just passing the student object itself, saying link to the student. And Rails will just infer to itself, it's like, oh, you've given me a student object, I'll check to see if there's a student path in the routing system. There is, it'll use it. So that if I reload this page, it does the same thing. And I can now do the same thing inside of the house show pages. If I go to any given house, I can make all of these links to the appropriate students as well. So if I go to that, which is my app views houses show, I can make it so that the student name is a link to the student name. Got a typo less. And where am I linking to? I'm linking to the student. So this is in my houses show view, changing the text to be a link to the student. So if I go back over here, those are all links now. and they work as expected. There's Hufflepuff. There's a student in Hufflepuff. They are in Hufflepuff. Everything seems to be working correctly. Just going to take a quick peek here. Yeah, that makes sense. It might also be nice in this student's index action to specify the house of each one of these students and also link to the house of each student. We already have a way of linking to the houses. We built that before. Here it is. If we looked at that view, that's the house index view, we can see that we are linking to those houses in the same way. A link to with some link text passing in the house object, and that properly links to the individual houses. So we should be able to do that inside of the student's index. So when in the student index, when I'm looping through my collection of all students, I could say something like student name, and then I could say of house, and then I could link to the student house name. That's going to be the text. So I'm using my association. In my model, we have a belongs to and has many association, active record association set up between a student and a house, making use of that foreign key, the house ID foreign key. So I can just chain from the student to its house object, and then on the house object, access the house object's name property. And then I can, for the second argument here, just link to the student house. Maybe put a period at the end of it. I put this link on a different line. It won't actually be on a different line in the rendered HTML because HTML ignores extra white space and extra new lines. It's just there for readability in my view. So that'll be just one long uninterrupted sentence in the rendered output. And so if I go back to my browser and I go to the students page, we now see the student names and their houses. There is a problem though. Did I talk about in this section n+1 issues yet? The idea of like an n+1? Has anyone heard of the sort of the classic problem in applications that typically deal with the database and often involve an object relational mapper like Active Record called the n+1 problem? Have you heard anyone refer to that before? Oh, our application suffers from an n+1, or the performance here is degraded by an n+1. You'll hear that, and I'll show you exactly what it means. If we look at the server that is running, first I'll show you what things look like when I will temporarily get rid of the call to this house. So in the view, I'll remove that just temporarily. I'll save my view and I'll reload this page. In the server, there was, to get all of those students, just a single HTML that was triggered. Or sorry, a single SQL statement that was triggered. Select student star from students, ordered by student. That's coming from the associated controller. That's this right here. One SQL statement generated by that one call. If I go back to the view though, and I put the house in there, how many SQL statements should there be in my output to retrieve the students, and all of their houses. If you are writing raw SQL yourself, you should be able to do it in one SQL statement. At most two, right? Because you could do like a join, or you could get all of the students, and then because you know all their IDs, you could find the houses that are associated with those students in a single SQL statement. But watch what happens when there's an ORM in place. When I add the houses in, what happened was I went and I got the students, and then for every individual student, we query for their house, one by one by one by one by one. That's the n+1 problem, because instead of one query or at most two queries, we have one query to get all the students, and then depending on how many students there will be n subsequent SQL statements generated where n is the number of students to fetch each of their houses. That's incredibly inefficient, right? Especially if you had thousands of students, you could end up firing off thousands of SQL statements. There is a very quick fix around this, but it's sort of on the programmer to make that fix. Active Record will try to delay its generation of SQL to the last possible moment to be efficient. So it doesn't fire off the SQL here, but the minute we start looping through the students, it does fire it off. And then all of a sudden you're asking for each student's house, and Active Record doesn't have that information. So for each pass of the loop here, it's having to fire off another SQL statement. So we can just hint to Active Record up front our intention, which is that, yes, in the view, we are going to need not only the student, but we need to include the information about the house. So I can just put in here, includes house. And by hinting to Active Record that I will eventually be using house information associated with these students, we have rid ourselves of that n+1 problem. And so n+1 problems are one of the largest sources of slowdowns in web applications. There are gems that you can actually plug into Rails applications, and their sole purpose is that in development mode, they just look for n+1s and tell you about them. And so the dot includes removes our n+1 issue when accessing the student houses in a view. So with that in place, I can go back to my server quickly. I'll hit enter a few times just so that we see a little break in the text. I will reload this, and you can see now we have simply done two queries. One to get all the students, and then one to get all of the students' associated houses. And there they are. And the way it did it was it looked at the collection of students that was present. It saw that out of this collection of students, there were only a certain number of houses that need to be retrieved, and it found those houses by ID. And so the SQL statement was a select star from houses where the house IDs were, and then there's like the 5 different IDs that are associated with the variety of students. And so it just needed to fetch the 5 houses rather than needing to fetch the house over and over and over, one per student. So that's a nice little hint. We could also put that over here, but we're not really suffering from an n+1 here in the show, because we're just getting the student and then showing the house. At most, there's going to be 2 requests already. It might be handy just to hint to other programmers our intent here. So it won't save us anything, but we could mark this as being like somewhere in the view we are going to make use of the house, but we're not going to get any performance boost by that because there's no n+1 problem in the show. We only have a single student. Fetching their house is a single other request, so it doesn't Doesn't help us performance-wise, but it might make our intent more clear to other programmers. They know up front here, oh, Kyle's probably making use of the student's house because he's marked it as an includes here. So that solves that little problem. No more n+1 in this page. Any questions on your behalf about anything that we've done up to this point in terms of our creating our application, which now has 2 models and 2 separate controllers and a total of 4 routes? So it's often quite, especially with a complicated system like Rails, it's often easy to watch and say, yeah, that makes lots of sense. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask you to do some coding yourself, just to make sure that when you actually put it into action, things make sense. And so what I'm going to get you to do is to create a new model, which is going to be a teacher model, a new controller, which is going to be a teacher's controller, and this is going to mirror very, very similarly what we did with students. So it's not like you have to do anything too new here. And one would argue that if I was making a real application here, the teacher model and the student model could actually be integrated into one like person model, where that person had a different role. Like, is this person a student? Is this person a teacher? But just for the sake of having a new model for you to create that's already been sort of visited in a way by way of the students, I'm going to sort of break it out into 2 separate models. So a teacher, just like a student, is going to have a name, which is a string. The teacher is going to have a foreign key that references a house, and you're going to need to make sure you go to the 2 models and forge the association with a has many and belongs to. Once you create your new teacher model, you're going to want to update the seed script to make sure you're generating fake teachers, and then you're going to want to rerun that seed script so that you have a bunch of houses that each have students associated with them, and maybe like 1 or 2 teachers per house. You're then going to generate a teacher's controller, which, just like student, is going to have 2 read actions, a collection action for finding and then displaying all teachers, and a member action for finding and displaying 1 teacher by ID. You're going to, in the routing file, create the 2 associated routes with the resources command. You're going to create the associated views, the index and the show one. You're going to implement the content inside of them. And if you get stuck anywhere along the way, just let me know and I can help you work through any problems that crop up. And so I'm going to pause the video now for you to work on that. So we're now returning to the point where I've got the teacher's model is now implemented and the teacher's controller is implemented. So on my home page, I now have 3 different links up at the top: home, student, teachers. I just put that one in so I'd have some way of navigating to that teacher's controller. If I click through there, we have a list of all the teachers and a list of their houses. If we look at this controller, it would have suffered the same n+1 problem as the students, because in the view, we're looping over the teachers and then requesting each house in turn. So we need to have that includes statement in there, which I'll see in a moment. We can now navigate to the teachers' houses, but we can also, for any given teacher, navigate to the teacher's page. And so how that was implemented, well, if I head over, close a bunch of my existing tabs here. In my model, I now have a teacher model. Not much in there. I could probably add some validations just like I did for the student. In fact, I'll just copy the validation that I have. That's something I didn't mention, but I might as well put that in here. Teacher is required to have a name in order for the object to be valid. A teacher belongs to a house. If we go to the other side of the association, the house has two has manys. This is one of those instances where you can't just stack them side by side. So you can't say has many students, comma, teachers. The has many command just doesn't work in that manner. So you have to have two has many statements, one for students, one for teachers. So that way a house object, you can now go to dot students or dot teachers to see the associated collection. And for a teacher, you can now go to dot house on a teacher object to see the associated house by way of the foreign key. So that was the model that I created. At any time, if you want to see what your database looks like, you can always go into the DB folder and look at the Schema RB file. And it's basically, it's almost like all of your migrations sort of in one, showing sort of the fact that, okay, we have a houses table and these are the columns, we have a students table and these are the columns, you can see the foreign key on there. Same thing goes for teachers, you can see the foreign key on there. One of the things that I've noticed when adding foreign keys to tables after the fact. So in this case, we created the teachers database. We did so with this migration. And when we created teachers is when we added the foreign key. Sometimes things are not that clean. You might have created the teachers table all on its own, just with a name, and then realized, you know, some days or weeks later, okay, I need a foreign key on this. And then there's a way of creating Rails migrations that are almost like alteration migrations. So it'll be a migration simply to add that foreign key. And one of the things I noticed that just a bit of a gotcha is that with SQLite, SQLite gets upset about adding a null false foreign key once the table's already created, and the only way to get the migration to run is to allow nulls on that column. That's not a problem when you move to Postgres, but just know that if you ever get into that situation in this course where you're adding a reference after the fact to the table, SQLite will complain until you change that null false to null true. I'll save that. So that is the model. There is a controller that I generated with a Rails G command, and it is the teacher's controller. And it looks very much like our student controller in that I'm loading up a collection of teachers, including the houses, and a single teacher, including the house, ordering them by name or finding by the ID from the URL. So very little is different from what we did with our students here. And then in the associated views, again, not that different from the index and the show view for the students. If I go into my teachers subfolder, I can see those. The show just shows that individual teacher. It links to the teacher's house by name. In the index, I test to see if there are no teachers, but if there are, I loop through them, linking to both the teacher's show page and the house show page. And the only thing left is the routing system. If I head over to the routes here, there is the teacher's route, and I can comment them in the same way. Teachers is going to teachers index, and I get request to teachers / some ID is going to the teachers show. The only other thing that I will show briefly is if I remove the only here and I ask for all of the resources associated with teachers, I can go to my web app, I can put in a route that doesn't exist, and I can see all the 7 RESTful routes that are being generated for me. So when I ask for everything, I get all of these routes right here. the one that we have been using, or the two that we've been using, are the index one and the show. But it's worth noting that if you need to create new teachers by way of your website, you're going to want these pair of routes, which are the create and the new routes. Just having the routes doesn't implement any of the functionality, but it puts the routes in place in sort of the standardized way with the standardized paths and the standardized HTTP verbs. And so the idea behind the new, so going to a GET request to /teacher/new, that's going to be up to you when you generate that view to make a form for filling out details about a new teacher. And when that form is submitted, where it gets submitted to is this teacher's create action. And it's the create action that actually does the active record creation. Same thing goes for editing. There's a pair of routes there. /teachers/ some placeholder ID /edit. That also, it's going to be up to you to implement a form that loads up all of the teacher data and displays it for editing. And when that form gets submitted, it's going to be sent over to the update action. And for historical reasons, the update action triggers both with a patch and an HTTP put request. And then there's also a delete that responds to a delete request to /teacher/ID. So there are a number of these routes that are member routes that have an ID in them that are for directly viewing or manipulating an existing object. And then there's a number of them that are more collection routes that have nothing to do with a particular member. And if you ever want, even though just using the resource doesn't sort of build up any of those actual actions and views for you, anytime you run the scaffolding command, so Rails G scaffold, it will create all that for you. So sometimes I just do that so I can reference like what is the standard way of building the create action and view or the new action and view. Sometimes I just have like a Rails project off to the side and all it contains is a single scaffolded resource so that I can reference how those things were done if I need that kind of functionality in my own application. So those are the 7 RESTful routes. I will go back to only requesting 2 of them here, just by saying that. And that's all I got for you for today. And so tomorrow we don't have any class because I will be at the Directions Conference. So yeah, no classes tomorrow. We will have a class on Friday though, where we continue this application. So that's the sort of the flow of this course is that initially in the course there's a lot more lectures than there are labs, and then when it comes time to actually work on the 2 individual projects, we sort of switch over to there's more lab time versus lecturing time. So we're still in sort of the lecture heavy portion of the course where I'm trying to get through as much Rails material as possible to get you to the point where you can implement your individual projects, starting with that first project. Any outstanding questions about this application or even the project that's upcoming? All right, thank you very much for coming to class today and working on our Hogwarts app.